Thank you, Stephen, for the choice of those hymns. Once again, thank you for coming out on this rainy evening to join us. If you're on Zoom, we envy you in the comfort of your home, but we're also welcome you as well. This is the fourth study in the book of Numbers, and I would ask you to turn in your Bibles to Numbers chapter 11. Numbers chapter 11, and we'll commence reading at verse 1. And when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, and the Lord heard it, and his anger was kindled. And the fire of the Lord burnt among them and consumed them that were in the uttermost parts of the camp. And the people cried unto Moses, and when Moses prayed unto the Lord, the fire was quenched. And he called the name of the place Taberah, because of the fire of the Lord burnt among them. And the mixed multitude that was among them fell a-lusting. And the children of Israel also wept again and said, Who shall give us flesh to eat? We remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt, freely, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlics. But now our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all besides this manna before our eyes. As I've said, this is the fourth study in the book of Numbers, and as I said starting last week, it is not meant to be a verse-by-verse commentary, but rather a study looking at some of the major themes that are included in this book. This morning we looked at chapters 5 to 10, and we looked at the preparation for the Great March. After spending over a year, close to 2 years at Mount Sinai, finally the day came when they began to move, when the cloud rose up and they said, it's time to go. And that was Numbers chapter 10, verses 11 to 13. According to Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 2, the journey that they were about to take part in from Mount Sinai up to the border of the Promised Land should have taken 11 days. That journey is recorded in chapters 11 to 14, which we are going to look at this evening. And you might think, given all the preparation and safeguards that are listed that we looked at this morning, it should be a victorious march which would carry them right over the border, right into the Promised Land. But as you study these chapters in Numbers, you will see how it all went so terribly wrong. Over the course of just a few weeks, everything fell apart. And that's going to be the topic of our study this evening. What caused that? Our topic title would be The Complaining Spirit. I want us to examine our hearts in this regard and ask if any of these same characteristics can be found in us, because we're going to see where it leads to. Right away in chapter 11, verse 1, we read, the people complained. Other translations say they murmured about their misfortunes. It does not seem to be about any specific reason given here. That will come soon enough. But just a general sense of discontent. And it might have included such thoughts as, woe is us. Who knows what's going to happen now that we are on the move? Is life really going to get better for us? Just general murmurings. And although it's not directed at anything in particular, the Lord heard it, and he was angry at them. Fire was sent down, and it burned the outskirts of the camp. The words in verse 1, them that were, in verse 1, is in italics, and therefore the translators have added it. It was not in the original, so it would actually read, "And the fire of the Lord burnt among them and consumed the uttermost parts of the camp," implying that the fire burned and consumed likely the outskirts of the camp, probably shrub bushes, not actual people, as you might get from the words that are there in italics. Nevertheless, it is a warning from God regarding their attitude. And Hebrews chapter 12, verse 29 reminds us, "For our God is a consuming fire." It produces remorse amongst the people, but not repentance. And they get Moses to pray for them. As you read through the account of their journey in the wilderness, Moses was looked upon by the people as having greater access to God compared to even the high priest, Aaron. And they often go to Moses to intercede for them. And here, once again, Moses' intercessory prayer is effective. Murmuring, complaining. Often we just will excuse it and say, well, that's just who I am. That's just my personality. And we try and pass it off. But in this study, we're going to see where it leads. It is the opposite of saying, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say, rejoice. Philippians 4:4. And it goes against the advice of Philippians 2:14, which says, do all things without murmuring and disputation. A person who constantly complains usually does not have that one fault. Usually it goes along with other characteristics that you can see in them, such as no patience. I can't wait for this. They were just ridiculous having this long lineup. Secondly, they feel rules do not apply to them. They're for other people, but I am an exception. So they chafe at any restriction, and they complain against the people who made the rules. Well, those rules are just dumb anyway, so I can break them. Murmuring, complaining. As I said, it may seem a very small problem, and we may excuse it in our character, but watch where it leads and where the whole thing goes wrong. You might argue and say, but does that mean we never get to question things and we always have to accept the status quo? No. If you have a serious question, take it to the Lord and ask for guidance. Our leaders should be open to legitimate questions that you might have about certain affairs. But that's not what is meant here in the book of Numbers. The people here had a nature which was that of always murmuring. Nothing would satisfy them, and complaining. The specific topic of food becomes the issue which seems to focus their attention in verse 4. It says it started with the mixed multitude. That means it started with those who were not Jewish that came out with the people from the land of Egypt. It wasn't just the children of Israel that came. A lot of people said, hey, they've got something going for them. They have a powerful God. We'll join them and see what we can get out of it. It started the murmuring with the mixed multitude, but then it spreads to the actual nation of Israel. What was the complaint? We are tired of this manna, the repetition of it. We've had it now for almost 2 years. We want variety. Verse 5. Remember the fish, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions and garlics. Can't you imagine just closing their eyes and thinking those delicious foods that they had in Egypt? Verse 4. We want more meat to eat. What brought that about? I'm going to suggest to you that it was a carryover from actually a blessing that they had just recently enjoyed. Recall in our last study that one of the preparations for the march in chapter 9 was that they would keep the Passover. It was the first time since leaving Egypt that they had done so. And as you recall from the instructions for the Passover in Exodus, it required that each household was to slay and to eat a lamb, as well as having unleavened bread, as well as having bitter herbs, some vegetables to go with it. And for that great a company, it must have meant that many lambs would have had to have been slaughtered. So Exodus chapter 12, verse 38 tells us that a great number of flocks and cattle went out with them from Egypt to meet their needs. The feast of Passover was meant as a blessing to show them their redemption. But I have to wonder if it turned into a source of their complaining. They would say, we liked that feasting at Passover. Why cannot we do that more often? For bread, all we get is this manna. Verses 7 to 9 remind us what it was like. It was their staple food in the wilderness. And it would be prepared in a variety of ways, and you can bake it, you can cook it, you can fry it, you can do whatever you want with it, but it's still manna. And after eating it for over a year, they were bored with God's provision, and they wanted more variety in their life. We have enough blessings in Christ, who is our Passover, to last us for all our life, indeed for all of eternity. If you think you are missing out on life and you want way more variety, be careful. You're in the same position as these people. They would never give thanks to God for sustaining them in an inhospitable environment through the provision of manna. There's no mention here of saying, it'd be nice to have more variety, but I thank God for what I've got. As Paul would say, I'm content in whatever state I'm in. No, it's only complaining of other things that they wanted. And this constant complaining even caused Moses to despair. Verses 10 to 22. So note the progression. It starts just as a spirit of murmuring, discontent. That leads to number 2, specific complaints, which grow in intensity so that number 3, even it affects the leadership. These verses are not just Bible history from long ago. This still affects us today. Listen to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 6. Now these things were our example, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they lusted. Verse 10 to 12 of that chapter in Corinthians. Neither murmur ye as some of them also murmured and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened unto them for examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Wherefore, let him that thinketh he standeth take heed, lest he fall. Paul says it's not just something that occurred hundreds of years ago. These instructions are for us as well. Paul warns us, do not have a complaining nature. It leads to wanting things we do not need. And it leads us to becoming bitter with a complaining spirit. And that in turn leads to destroy our trust in the Lord for his sustaining power. Moses was overwhelmed by the constant complaints. Here in Numbers 11, verse 13, he says, where am I going to find enough meat to feed all of these people on a regular basis? He even goes as far as in verse 15 to say, that's it, kill me, rather than leave me with this overwhelming job of this complaining people. The Lord responds by giving Moses to share his responsibility. He gives him 70 other elders to help with the spiritual oversight of the people. And the Lord promises to give the people food in verse 18. I want you to look at the measured judgment of God in verses 19 and 20. When God's anger is displayed, it's not spontaneous. It's not just spur of the moment, all right, act. God is not like that. When God's anger is given, it's given in a measured response. And look how he talks. He says, you will have meat, not for just one day, not for 10, not for 20. The repetition as God speaks these words shows that God is in control. His anger is not a burst of anger, it's controlled. He said, all right, you'll have it, not for 10, not for 20, moving it out. You will have it for 1 month until you are sick of it. Verse 31, the Lord sends quails in enormous numbers for miles around the camp that they can pick up and use as their food. This was actually the second time that God has provided quails to them. The first was recorded in Exodus chapter 16, verse 13. But never in this amount and for this length of time as occurred here in Numbers. And while the people were still eating, the Lord sent out a plague, maybe even through tainted meat that had been lying there for too long. And the people died because of it. Verse 34. Here's the important message of this passage. Getting what we want is not a sure sign that God is blessing us. Let me repeat that. Getting what we want is not and is never a sure sign that God is blessing us. The people could have said, it's a miracle. We got quails. The Lord is blessing us. We must be doing things right. No. If we do not pray, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, then our prayers can become that of a spoiled child, demanding something from their parents over and over again. I want. That's a spoiled child. And yet that was the nature of these people. Several of the Psalms comment on these people's attitude. The one which is most expressive is Psalm 106. Listen to 3 verses from that psalm. Verse 13. They soon forgot his works. They waited not for his counsel, but lusted exceedingly in the wilderness and tempted God in the desert. Verse 15. And he gave them their requests, but sent leanness into their souls. When we complain and get what God never intended for us to have, it will come with a great cost. That cost will be in our soul. We will have no permanent satisfaction in what we obtained. We will realize to our fault how it brings misery to us, to others, and ultimately we will see how it puts us farther from God himself. Indeed, as the psalm says, it brought leanness to their souls. It may be an object, it may be some material thing that you want. It may be a relationship that God does not want you to have. But we go ahead, we are committed to it, we get it, and the psalm says, you'll have it, but it'll bring leanness to your soul. That's what happened here, and that's the message takeaway from this portion of Numbers. The Epistle of the Hebrews tells us that without faith, it is impossible to please God. And to get only what we want, even in out of a Christian life, does not exercise faith. And Romans chapter 14 says that whatever is not of faith is sin. We looked this morning at chapter 5 at things that we were to be put away, the lepers and all the issues. Those were things that were obvious because they were on the outside. If you were a leper, everybody could see that. If you had touched a dead person, everybody knew that. Murmuring and complaining is something on the inside, and yet it is just as destructive. When God supplies our needs, and we have our faith in him to supply those needs, then the answer to those prayers will always come with his peace and his blessing, and it will not bring leanness to your soul. So, murmuring is how it started. It led to complaining about specific issues. That leads in turn to lacking faith in God. They substituted their own will and found that it did not satisfy. In Numbers chapter 12 to 18, their complaints now focus on their leaders. It now turns away from food, it advances, becomes larger, and they start blaming other people for the situation they're in. It begins in Numbers chapter 12. Miriam and Aaron, Moses' own sister and brother, speak out against him. The way the chapter is written, it appears that Miriam started the complaint. Aaron, in the biblical narrative, comes across as someone who's very easily persuaded. He's not too strong a character, if you like, on his own. You recall that he did the same thing in the episode of the golden calf. The people said, make the calf? All right, I'll make the calf for you. He's easily persuaded. And it appears that this is also the case here. He's influenced by his sister. The details of the complaint by Miriam are not given with enough detail to explain her viewpoint. But it says in chapter 12, verse 7, Moses had married an Ethiopian woman. We do not know anything more about her. Some commentators try and equate her with his wife Zipporah, but that's unlikely, given the fact that Zipporah was from Midian. She was a Midianite. And this woman is described as a Cushite or an Ethiopian. So had his first wife died? We do not know. Whatever the circumstances, his sister Miriam thought it was not right for Moses to marry this woman. Perhaps it was racism. She was Ethiopian, and dare I say, therefore, was black. Or was it just personal jealousy? The real issue, however, was that Moses' leadership and position, they felt, we are just as important before the Lord as Moses. The Lord can speak through us as well. Why does Moses this, Moses that? Why does he get all the preference? And in response, Moses shows the characteristics that we should model in verse 3. It says, he was meek, very meek, above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. He did not argue with them. He did not complain. He did not try and defend his position. He left his defense and his reputation with the Lord, who undoubtedly will take up his defense. God says, if there is a prophet among you, then I will speak to him in visions or dreams. But Moses is not like that. Moses is even closer to me than any prophet. I speak to him directly, mouth to mouth. Verse 8. The last part of that verse is a strong condemnation against Miriam and Aaron. And in effect, if you were to paraphrase the Hebrew, it says, how dare you speak against Moses? When he's that close to me. Miriam is judged with leprosy, and we saw what leprosy stood for this morning. And she must remain outside the camp for 7 days. Aaron admits that they have sinned. When you unjustly complain about a leader whom God has placed in authority, whether it's in the church or whether it's in government, you are putting yourself on dangerous ground. Peter tells us in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5, that younger people are to submit unto those who are older, and both groups are to show the quality which Moses displayed, that of humility. Peter says, God resisteth the proud and gives grace to the humble. Paul tells us in 1 Timothy 5:19 that if you're going to raise a complaint against an elder in the church, only do it before 2 or 3 witnesses in their presence. As I've said, if you continually complain against the leaders that God has ordained and put in position, you are on dangerous ground. let me put a personal quick aside here. If you are going to complain to a leader here at this assembly, I would ask you, please respect their time as well. Do not corner them on a Sunday morning before the breaking of bread or between services. They should be able to enjoy their time of worship as well, without always having their mind distracted to try and immediately deal with some problem that you've just brought up. They deserve to enjoy the worship time as well. Do not distract them from that. If you have a complaint, then make a date with them. Or say, I'll email you tomorrow. Respect their time as well. The background of unrest, which now includes Moses' own family of complaining, sets the stage for the major rebellion that occurs in chapters 13 and 14 when they reach the border of the promised land at Kadesh Barnea. 12 spies are sent out for 40 days to reconnoiter the land. And when they return, 2 of the 12, Caleb and Joshua, recommend that they go forward. Yes, they say there are obstacles, but with God's help, we can do this. The other 10 men state, yes, the land is fruitful, and yes, it would be wonderful to be there, but the enemy is too strong. We saw the Anakim. We were just like grasshoppers in their sight. We cannot do it. And chapter 14, verse 1 shows the people believed the 10 men. And verse 2 says what? They murmured. There it is again. Against Moses and against Aaron. And they believed the 10 men. And in verse 9, Caleb and Joshua try to show them that they are rebelling, not just against the leadership, but against God himself. Verse 10 shows where the complaining would have led. It says they were in the process of wanting to actually stone Caleb and Joshua for telling the truth. And the Lord steps in to intervene. Moses, showing his great compassion as a leader, seeks to intervene again, verses 13 to 19, and I encourage you to read it on your own, for it reveals the great heart of compassion that Moses had as a leader. It's exactly the opposite of complaining and murmuring when he speaks to the Lord about the people. And God once again listens to him and pardons the people's sin. But at the same time, God says, enough is enough. They have gone against me 10 times. Their complaining never stops. And now they will face discipline. Murmuring, complaining, rebellion. It's a downward spiral. The 10 spies died immediately in verse 37. And the rest of the warrior group, except Caleb and Joshua, would never enter the promised land and would die over the next 40 years. And God said, your carcasses will fall in the desert. But I want you to look specifically at Numbers chapter 14, verses 29 and 30. Your carcasses shall fall in this wilderness, and all that were numbered of you, according to your whole number from 20 years old and upward, which have murmured against me. Doubtless ye shall not come into the land concerning which I swear to make you dwell therein, save Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun. Who is the Lord talking about for that judgment? The judgment fell on all those that were numbered. Verse 29, all that were numbered of you. That's who the judgment is going to fall on, according to your whole number from 20 years on upwards. Who is that? That's the number that we looked at in the first study. That's the men of the warrior census of chapter 1. When we studied the tribe of Levi, I asked you to tuck away the fact to remember that they were listed in a separate census. They were not numbered with the others that were 20 years and over in Numbers chapter 3. The tribe of Levi did not send one of theirs as a spy into the land. And therefore, they were separate from the rest of the nation. And the summary is that I believe the tribe of Levi was excluded from this judgment. For the rest of the nation, yes, for the military census, all of those men would die, except for Caleb and Joshua. But it would not apply to the tribe of Levi. Moses and Aaron would die before they got to the promised land, but that was for their own sin, not because of the judgment that's passed here. So you can take that thought. It's not what we usually hear. We usually think everybody died over the age of 20. Not true. The tribe of Levi was excluded. For the rest of the nation, however, this is the final outcome of complaining. Their goal of the promised land was never realized, and they did not get to see or experience God's blessing in the land. As many of you know, the land of Canaan is not a type of heaven, even though many hymns or poems represent it that way. The land of Canaan is a type of the further blessing that God has in store for those who follow him. Think of this. Everything that bothered the people, everything that made them complain, would have ended if they had shown faith in God. For example, they had complained of endless wanderings. That would have ended if they had crossed over into their inheritance. Instead, they continued to wander and die in the wilderness for another 38 years. They had complained about the boring food that they were eating and the manna, which other texts say they actually despised in the promised land. There was abundance of produce. It's called a land of flowing with milk and honey. It would have met all their needs. Everything that they complained about would have ended if they'd had faith in God. And instead of enjoying all those blessings, they will continue to know hardship, restrictions, and death in the wilderness. Therefore, the major message of this study is learn to correct your attitude of murmuring that leads to complaining, that leads to lack of faith, that leads to actual rebellion. in that downward spiral. It leads to bitterness. And before it ever has a chance to develop into full-fledged mutiny, put a stop to it. We remember that we read Paul said, "These things were written to teach us as well." An ungrateful attitude of complaining will take over your life. And once that happens, we will miss out on the blessings that God had in store for us. God can and does continue to discipline his people as revealed in the New Testament. These terrible punishments and judgment, they are not just an Old Testament feature. We're told in Corinthians, in the most severe form, it may actually result in physical death of the believer if God has to exercise judgment on you. Pay attention to the warnings that he gives you. In this regard, the people ignored the very next warning they were given. In Numbers 14, verses 40 to 45, they tried to override God's prohibition. And in effect said, "Oh, we're sorry, we can go ahead, we can achieve this. We see where we were wrong, now we can go ahead and correct it." Moses said, "Don't go up. The Lord's not with you." "Oh, that's okay, we understand, we can go ahead and do this." Don't go up. The Lord is not with you. And sadly, they ignored the warning. They tried to cross over on their own strength, and they were defeated by the Amalekites as they attempted to enter into the promised land. And the lesson is that it is just as wrong to run ahead of God's plans and substitute our own will. It is just as wrong to do that as it is to lag behind and not carry out his commands at all. Does all this mean that God's plans and efforts for the promised lands are thwarted? Does it mean it's all ended in disaster? Not at all. So let's end on a positive note. Turn over to Numbers chapter 15, verse 1. "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them," now get this, "When you be come into the land of your habitation, which I give unto you, and will make an offering by fire unto the Lord, a burnt offering or sacrifice, etc., etc." God could have said, "You've lost your inheritance. It's over. And it's all because of your sin. And I have every right to say that's the end." But chapter 15 gives instructions regarding offerings that they will give. When? When you enter into the promised land. It's still going to happen. Nothing has changed God's purpose. The people will enter the land, but it will be the next generation that does this. Recall that when we studied the census of chapter 1, all of those men, except for Joshua and Caleb, died. Yet in the census of chapter 26, the overall number has not really changed at all. 99.7% of that population was still there in the next generation. God has continued to bless them. God raised up and preserved the new generation, and his blessings will be carried out. His sovereign will happen. because God's purposes will always be accomplished. The question is, will his purposes be accomplished through us to enjoy this, or will it be through someone else that hasn't murmured and complained and rebelled? I'd ask you to examine your hearts in these issues. And let's close by those same words that I referred to earlier, Philippians chapter 2, verse 13. For it is God which worketh in you, both to will and to do of his good pleasure. Do all things, without murmurings and disputings, that ye may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom ye shine as lights in the world. Do all things without murmurings and disputings. Let us close in prayer. Our Father, these are heavy lessons for us. We all confess that in our hearts there are murmurings, there are complaints. Father, help us to take the lessons that are given here in Numbers to see that we need to stop it before it advances and destroys our life. Father, we thank thee that your purposes will never be thwarted, but help us to realize that we need to examine our walk and our thoughts, that we are in tune with your plans. Help us to put aside those things that we think are so important, because if we get them, they will bring leanness to our souls. Therefore, we thank thee for the teaching of this book. We thank thee especially for the example that we have in Moses, someone who is humble and offers intercessory prayer. And may we be a like example to those illustrated in this book. Bless us, therefore, as we depart. In your Son's name, amen. I might just finish with a postscript saying there's 21 chapters still to go. So stay tuned. We will carry on with the series in about a month's time at the end of May.